Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Harry Niska. I'm the House Majority Leader. I represent House District 31A, which is Ramsey and Andover. And I wanted to talk to you this morning about the first bill that we're going to have up for a vote on the House floor today. It's House File 20. It's a very small bill. It should be very uncontroversial, you would think. It changes two words in Minnesota's Sunlight Law, which is called the Data Practices Act. It's the law that protects our right as the people of Minnesota to know what's going on in our government so that we can hold our government officials democratically accountable. It is absolutely crucial to our democracy that we know what is happening with our public resources in our public offices. And unfortunately, because of a 2022 Minnesota Supreme Court decision, our Attorney General's office has special secret protection under that statute. They get to hide things in the category of private data on individuals, things that are protected under our scheme because of the privacy interests that we're concerned about protecting. But they are able to protect data even when no individual is involved, even when there's no personal privacy interest that would be protected by that data. So what that has resulted in the Attorney General's office is that they get to hide policy-making information, the special interests that are influencing the work of that office, and they also get to hide investigative data. Every other prosecutor's office or law enforcement office in Minnesota has to disclose closed investigative data, but the Attorney General's office, because of this interpretation from 2022 by the Minnesota Supreme Court, is able to shield all of that information from public view. There's been a lot of discussion recently about fraud in Minnesota state government. That's one of the areas where we don't know what investigations have happened in the Attorney General's office and have been closed that they're shielding from public view as a result of this Minnesota Supreme Court decision in 2022. So all we do in House File 20 is fix that Minnesota Supreme Court decision by adding to the definition of public data on individuals the words on individuals to make sure that we are talking about data that actually relates to an individual person. Justice Thiessen, former DFL Speaker Paul Thiessen, wrote the dissent in that 4-3 decision. He called the interpretation that was advocated by the Attorney General's office Orwellian. I 100% agree with him. This should be an obvious gimme vote for everybody to say we are for transparency, we are for openness, we are for the government not hiding what it's doing when there is no privacy interest that needs to be protected of an individual person. So we're going to bring this vote forward. I have been told twice on the record by Democrats that every single Democrat in the Minnesota House is going to side with their party bosses and protect the secrecy of the information from the people of Minnesota. We will see how that actually transpires on the floor today, but I think it's important, again, for the purposes of transparency, that the people of Minnesota know what side the representatives are on this question, on this issue. So happy to take questions.
So in other words, you're saying that by putting on individuals or about individuals, whatever the two words were, that is clarifying the scope of what is protected, because that Supreme Court decision left open a lot more than just data on individuals.
Absolutely. So the Supreme Court decision is Energy Policy Advocates versus Ellison, and that was the key issue in that case, whether the protection for private data on individuals only covers data where an individual is actually involved and has a privacy interest. And the Attorney General's office said, no, we get to classify data as private data on individuals, even when there is no individual with an actual person with a privacy interest involved. So that's exactly what this bill does. It adds those two words, the two words that tripped up the Supreme Court majority, the two words that Justice Thiessen said would clarify this. Although I agree with him that we shouldn't have needed to make this clarification. The Supreme Court interpreted that statute wrong, but we do have to clarify that in order to correct that misinterpretation.
Has your caucus submitted data requests that have been rebuffed? And I guess if so, like what type of data have you all saw?
So we haven't, our caucus hasn't, but the case came up in the context of a group called Energy Policy Advocates that was looking at information about the ways that the Attorney General's office is being influenced by special interest groups, specifically around energy litigation. There are special interest groups that are actually funding lawyers who are in that office and doing other things to influence that. And that's something that goes across party lines, right? There are special interest groups on both sides of the aisle that are trying to influence Attorney General's offices to do certain types of litigation, one way or the other, even funding lawyers who are, using public authority, but being funded by private funding. And that's the kind of information that the Attorney General's office is holding back from the public because they are trying to classify that as private data on individuals, trying to hide behind what would be a personal privacy interest of some individual. That's the reason we have that classification in the statute. It's not to protect or to prevent the public from knowing what the Attorney General's office is doing with that public office.
What other groups do you think are funding positions in the Attorney General's office?
So we do know that NYU is funding positions in the Attorney General's office, and that there are private funders. The Bloomberg Foundation, I think, is behind some of that. The problem is, we're getting at exactly the question. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know what's being hidden from public view. That should be very concerning to every Minnesotan. Why is it that the Attorney General's office is fighting so hard to keep the public from knowing what's going on in the office?
Like, you're not talking about FTEs, are you? Or are you just talking about like, we are funding attorneys to help on X specific case?
No, and some of this is public in job postings. There are jobs that are posted as, this is a special assistant attorney general working in the Attorney General's office funded by the Bloomberg Foundation through NYU, things like that.
Have you talked with the AG about, their office's stance on the bill?
Yes, I had a conversation with the Attorney General on January 17th, broadly about what the Attorney General's office does and needs to do in places where he and I agree on important areas of funding and on challenges on how we're going to get that funding done, especially in with 67 or 68 Republicans in the House. And I specifically raised this issue with him. He has, Senator Cruen is here. He is carrying the companion bill in the Senate. The Attorney General's office put in a letter of opposition to both in both the Senate committee and the House committee on this bill. Again, it's not surprising. They went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court in order to prevent the public from knowing this information. So they're not interested in supporting legislation that would make them have to, again, be as public about information as every other government agency in the state of Minnesota. The governor's office doesn't have this protection. Prosecutors' offices don't have this protection. Every other office subject to the Data Practices Act has to disclose closed investigative data or policy-making data, and they don't get to hide it as private data on individuals. It's only the Attorney General's office that has this special secret privilege under the Data Practices Act, under this particular interpretation.
What was his reason that he gave why he opposes this?
The only thing he said to me in that conversation was that he was concerned about generally the cost that they have when they're dealing with data practices requests. Every government agency has to deal with data practice requests, and that's part of the cost of our democracy, frankly, that we get to see what's going on in offices. He did raise, concerns about family farms potentially, situations where like a business maybe should be thought of or treated more like an individual, as having an individual privacy interest. I think that might be an interesting conversation about the Data Practices Act in general. I thought it was kind of interesting that on this issue, he is recognizing like sort of corporate personhood, some interests that that businesses might have that's like a person. And that's a conversation, like I said, that would be a conversation broader about the Data Practices Act. It shouldn't be something where, again, the Attorney General's office is getting special treatment and special privilege to hide stuff. But that's not the real concern. The concern is about nonprofits that are, or other interest groups that are influencing the Attorney General's office that they want to hide from public view.
Can you explain to me, maybe you've already tried to do, but how this is not redundant? It adds two words, the following data on individuals,
Yeah.
created, collected, and maintained by the OAG, or private data on individuals.
Yes. So that's exactly the problem that Justice Thiessen was having with the majority's opinion. So the majority said, because it doesn't have that repetitive language, private data on individuals, then it doesn't need to be data on individuals. It can be any data, even data that doesn't implicate any particular person. So I would agree with you that we shouldn't have to add this language. The only reason we have to add this language is because 4 justices of the Minnesota Supreme Court said, without that language, then the Attorney General's office gets to hide information that doesn't implicate any individual person's privacy interest.
But that kind of information there could be some information that's very sensitive related to investigations that could still be private because of that distinction.
Oh, absolutely. So yes, the way the Data Practices Act works is that any data that implicates an individual person's privacy interest gets classified as private data on individuals, which is a category that makes it only accessible to the subject of that information. So if you are the person that the Attorney General's office has been investigating, or you are the person who made a complaint to the Attorney General's office, your data gets protected from everybody except for you. You still have a right to it. That's why that's the purpose of this particular role. So it does, this particular category. So it doesn't make any sense then to classify something as private data on individuals when there is no individual who would have that special right to have access to that information. Again, I agree with the point that we shouldn't have to add this language. The only reason we have to add this language is because the 4 justices on the Minnesota Supreme Court disagreed with Justice Thiessen and you, I guess, that's the obvious way to read the language. Justice Thiessen called this interpretation Orwellian, and I think that's an apt description of it.
Could you step back and talk a little bit about, no, not physically step back, but just zooming out, what this is the first bill you're bringing with the temporary advantage, what other GOP priority bills as a member of leadership do you expect to come up before the special election?
Yep, so we are bringing bills to the floor as they are able to get through committee, so that's one of the considerations. Obviously, this is a bill that was a Republican-introduced bill 2 years ago. It didn't get a hearing. It's something that I think should be a gimme as a starting point. It should be pretty obvious to everyone who's in favor of democracy, who's in favor of transparency. This should be a 133-0 vote. If it's not today, if the Democrats' threat to vote against it as a unified bloc holds true, I think it's important that the people of Minnesota see that.
And if that happens, you don't have 68 votes to pass it. I guess with that in mind, like, how are you guys gaming out, to Tori's question, like, maybe certain bills that won't get DFL support, but you maybe want to put them on the record as voting against?
Yeah, I think that if you're watching bills go through committees, there are a number of those kind of bills that I'm not going to, preview the exact schedule today, but yes, there are a number of bills that are going to come to the floor so for the purpose of the people of Minnesota, again, seeing transparency where the Democratic Party stands on a lot of issues that we think are pretty obvious. We think the people of Minnesota would see as pretty obvious things to support.
Sorry, if I can just follow up really quick. As a kind of technical procedural question, if it doesn't pass because you don't have 68 votes for it, is there a universe in which, the bill would, to me, it would seem like it's dead, but could you, if in the course of negotiations with the other side later in session, perhaps revive it in a different way, just with a different bill number on it? Is that all it takes?
Yeah, there are a lot of options, and yeah, stay tuned.
If you were the AG, could you interpret this differently?
So I think that the Attorney General's office, certainly the Attorney General's office can decide how they respond to data practice requests as an initial thing, and can decide whether or not to shield certain information from public view. The Minnesota Supreme Court has now sort of interpreted it as a matter of the courts. Other actors could interpret it differently in ways that maybe wouldn't get challenged in court. I think that there would be, I think it would be good if an attorney general came into office and said, I'm going to be more transparent than the last attorney general's office, and they would have some discretion about that.
Are you considering
Yes.
running for attorney? Are you considering running for attorney general in 2026?
I have a lot of work to do. I haven't even thought about that.
I just add some context to that. This statute, as it is currently drafted, was interpreted for over 40 years by multiple attorneys general, where they routinely produced it. It wasn't until this attorney general came into office that he stopped producing these types of materials, which led to the lawsuit, which led to the court opinion. So yes, it has been, not just could be interpreted different, it has been for over 40 years.
Bill, do you have any thoughts on the political front of all the lawsuits that the Attorney General has been filing against the Trump administration?
I think there's been a hair trigger by the Attorney General's office to try to use, again, it's the same lawfare strategy that's been used against, President Trump and then candidate Trump and now President Trump again. Certainly, I think it's right for the Attorney General's office, the Minnesota Attorney General, to stand up for the prerogative of the state. If the federal government, if any federal actor is overstepping their bounds, I think what we have seen lately hasn't been sort of a careful, thoughtful approach, but has been a jump onto everything filed by any Democrat attorney general across the country. Again, I can't get into the detail. I'm not deep in the weeds on all this federal policy stuff. Like I said, I've got kind of a lot of work to do. I think you all have noticed that. We've got some big problems to figure out here over the next few months. But the knee-jerk joining into every far left lawsuit against the Trump administration, I think, is not the right approach for Minnesota.
To kind of just return to Tori's question, potentially, I guess, fish for the obvious soundbite here. But I mean, are the bills you guys are bringing forward bills wouldn't make it through without committee power?
So I will speak specifically on this bill. We have been told that the Democrats in the House are going to stand with their Attorney General to hide information from the public. And so it was important to us that we move this bill forward while we have the procedural ability to do that.
And I suppose just for the rest of the bills, that while you guys have this majority in committees, are you guys fast tracking those bills to the floor?
Yeah, I think that's been obvious that Republicans with the control in the committees are talking about the priorities that the people of Minnesota talked to us about on the campaign trail. And we think that the Democrats are out of touch on a lot of these issues, and it's important that the people of Minnesota see that.
Do you have any legitimate indications of bipartisan support for any of your priority bills, from even just the OIG one potentially?
Well, I think Senator Kroon can talk a little bit about the similar bill that's moving in the Senate that he has bipartisan support on. It's been really interesting that we haven't seen a single Democrat step forward and say that they're supporting the similar OIG bill moving in the House. There are things that we would think should get bipartisan support. Repealing the nuclear moratorium has been something that there's been discussion about bipartisan support on in the past. Our permitting reform bill is modeled very much off of a narrower, we think too narrow, but helpful model that Democrats did support 2 years ago or last year. And so for some of these, we're kind of puzzled why there isn't at least some more appearance of or openness in the House caucus to bipartisan support. There are, I guess, maybe it's because there are no House members who have at least even called themselves blue dogs. There have been some Democrats who are in the Senate who are calling themselves blue dogs and at least are making some noises, more noises about doing something bipartisan. Obviously, to land this plane at the end of session, we are going to need to work across party lines, and so that's been disappointing that there hasn't been more of that from Democrats in the House so far.
This bill is related to Data Practices Act, and I feel like some agencies have lamented before that they are kind of crushed by so many requests that are really large in scope, and it just costs a lot of money and staff time to go through them when they're not narrow, and they're getting so many or over the last, I think, more recently in the last couple of years. So I'm wondering if you have any thought about that. Is there a discussion about in the spirit of transparency, more funding for these agencies to be dedicated to answering such requests, or how do you kind of perceive that issue, and have you heard anything similar?
Yeah, there's always discussion in state government, whatever budget is funding any particular agency, about the needs of those agencies. What's not acceptable, I don't think, from our perspective, and it shouldn't be acceptable to any Minnesotan, is the idea that we're going to hide information from the public under the guise of it's too expensive to have democracy function properly by having people, see what's actually happening in the government.
Should the legislature make itself subject to the Data Practices Act?
I don't think so. That's been a question that's been around a long time. The legislature has never been subject to the Data Practices Act in Minnesota. There are some particular reasons that hasn't historically been done. That is something that the Attorney General's office likes to point out, I think, in order to, again, argue for themselves to have this special protection under the Data Practices Act. All right. Thank you.